Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Designer's Notes here on Hexes and Soldiers. In this episode, we're going to take a look at Storm over Arnhem, Avalon Hill game that came out in 1981. And this was designed by, guess who? Courtney Allen, who should be familiar to you by now, if nothing else, because I did an episode on Courtney with Upfront. So it's the same gentleman. And this game is the first of the area impulse games that were done by Avalon Hill, which later included such titles as Thunder Casino, Turning Point Stalingrad, and Breakout Normandy. The game simulates the ferocious battle for the Arnhem Bridge on September 18th through the 21st in 1944. And the game begins with the British holding the area around the bridge, surrounded by the Germans. And a lot of games call themselves something to do with Arnhem, but really has to do with a lot of things leading up to the occupation of the area around the bridge. This starts out right there at the bridge. So the gist of this consists of trying to hold out basically as long as they can. Any of you that have seen the movie Bridge Too Far know full well what this is dealing with. And if you haven't yet seen that movie, I don't know why you wouldn't have, but definitely make that the top of your to-do list to watch The Bridge Too Far. Each full turn covers about 8 hours and includes a number of mini turns, or as they call them, impulses. With each impulse, the player can move or fire a small number of units. Once moved or fired, they're designated as committed. Cannot move or fire again until the next turn. And combat is dealt with by calculating attack and defense values, with each side adding two rolls a roll of two dice. The difference if the attacker has the higher total and final point values is your number of casualty points, and the defender must lose by retreating or destroying units. It's a low complexity game. That's not to say it is a bad game. It is a rather interesting game, if nothing else, for the subject matter it deals with. Also, the fact that it has these area movement locations as opposed to rigid traditional hexes. And in 1982, this title was the winner of the Charles S. Roberts Best 20th Century Game. And so, yeah, how about that? Uh, Cutting to the said designer's notes on page 11, we'll start with Storm over Arnhem. He states, was designed with playability foremost in mind. This should be quite obvious by the length and number of actual rules. Which may not be so obvious is the detailed analysis that went into the design of each rule section. Although many factors have been abstracted, it in no way means that they were not considered or included in some form during the design of the game, as I hope to demonstrate in the following paragraphs. Make sure we're recording here. Yes, we're good. So much of the ability to use exact terrain came from the fact that the game uses areas rather than the traditional hexagonal grid to regulate movement and combat. Rather than having to distort the terrain to conform to a hexagonal grid, as is done in most simulation games, the areas were drawn to fit the actual terrain. In point of fact, the areas were determined to a large extent by the city block configuration, lines of sight, and areas of maximum exposure. To illustrate this, let's look at areas 3 and 4, and if you like, you guys listening that own a copy of this, feel free to drag out boards areas 3 and 4 from the game, and you can follow along. Movement between these two areas would require crossing a street or area of exposure. To do so with any degree of assurance of actually getting to the other side would require some time and finesse, that is, increased movement costs. The sheer physical size of many of the blocks posed another kind of problem. An example here would be the single block composing areas 2 and 3. Firing from area 3 could be directed at area 18 without much problem, but certainly fire from most vantage points in area 2 could not. Area 11 illustrates yet another vantage point. One might wonder how a unit located here could fire effectively into area 12 and not into area 5. This becomes a line of sight question. Units defending area 11 are assumed to be located in the most advantageous buildings, the large multi-story factory at the west end of the area. From here, the units could easily fire over the small sheds located in the eastern half of the area, but not over the large trees in Area 6. Although every area depicted on the board is a little different, each followed a similar line of reasoning in determining its final boundaries. There are many excellent accounts of the British units which fought at Arnhem, so a complete order of battle was relatively easy to verify. One exception to this was obtaining the approximate number of men that actually made it to the bridge from Major Grove's recon squadron. Among other problems, the unit was ambushed on the way to the bridge, and it is unknown just how many men eventually made it to the bridge. I made my estimates based on the total number of men noted at the bridge before Gauck arrived and what was indicated at the maximum number of defenders at the bridge, 600 to 700 after their arrival. As long as we're counting heads, I'm sure most people have noticed a lack of any British and, to a lesser extent, German heavy weapons infantry units. Contrary to what one might think, they have been included in the game, although in a somewhat abstract manner. For the British, these weapons come largely from the HQ company, not to be confused with the actual company headquarter units. Although no separate counters have been included in the game for this company, these forces have not been overlooked. Historically, these units were spread out among the other companies of the battalion for additional support at platoon and squad level. Therefore, when considering the attack factors of each squad, one was added if the unit in question had received support from any heavy infantry weapons. The German order of battle proved to be more difficult given the state of refitting that the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were undergoing at that time. By this time, German units were always at reduced strength, especially when it came to armored vehicles. Careful study of available information resulted in an educated guess that the 10th Recon Battalion would have only 50% of their official listed AFE strength. The Heavy Weapons Company, like the British HQ Company noted previously, has its machine guns distributed among the infantry rifle companies of the battalion. Because the unit also included an engineer platoon, 81mm mortars, and some self-propelled guns, these were represented by separate counters. One last point concerning the German order of battle is worth touching on, if only for the purists among us. At least one popular account of the battle, makes reference to Mach 4 tanks at the bridge. More importantly, a British battle action summary indicates enemy losses included Mark IVs. If all this is true, one might ask why there aren't any Mark IVs in the game. Let's examine the British report in a little more detail rather than accepting it at face value. The report in question lists German vehicle losses at 6 Mark IVs, 1 Tiger tank, and 8 armored cars and half-tracks. Nowhere does it mention any Mark III loss. This seems strange since it is known that the Bocholt Training Battalion had 10 obsolete Mark IIIs in action at the bridge. Why then aren't there any reports of some of these tanks being destroyed? Certainly they would be easier than a Mark IV to knock out. It would seem from this that, as was often the case, the Mark IIIs were mistakenly recorded as Mark IVs. It became even more plausible when one considers that many of the British troops were in combat for the first time. For these reasons, and the lack of any hard data on units at the bridge operating with the Mark IVs, I went with using only the Mark IIIs in the game. To assess the combat units in game terms, each unit, except artillery, was given 3 basic values. The attack factor was based on the type of weaponry and whether the unit was supported by heavy weapons. The defense factor was a little more involved, but for infantry included such things as morale, training, experience, and terrain effects. The defense factor of armor units was based more on armor thickness than morale or training. Infantry units lose much of their terrain benefit by exposing themselves to return fire when moving or firing. British units generally have a higher terrain benefit because of the inherent advantage associated with the defensive position in street fighting. Each building occupied by the British was literally turned into a mini fortress. With such a large potential for concealment, the Germans were often confused as to which buildings were dangerous, occupied strong points, and found it difficult to concentrate the required strength against these critical areas. Armor units are always at a disadvantage in urban areas and gain very little from the surrounding terrain and consequently lose comparatively little by moving or firing. One point should also be made with respect to the increase in vulnerability of infantry, defense factor equals 6, when subject to an artillery attack while jointly occupying an area with a self-propelled gun, defense factor of 2. First, is assumed that the armor is drawing artillery fire to the otherwise unknown vicinity of the infantry. Secondly, and possibly more important, there's a morale dependency on armor whenever it is present. Loss of armor support, either by its destruction or withdrawal, could use the infantry under attack by the same shelling as who break and run, thereby causing further casualties. The core of each game turn, indeed the very heart of the game, lies within the movement fire phase, though I have tried to achieve a system with a feel of simultaneous movement while retaining the action-reaction sequence so characteristic of street fighting. The defender has the advantage, and that the attacker must chance exposure to move into position, allowing the defender to wait for the attacker to come to him. Command control also becomes an important problem inherent with urban fighting. Combat in these areas tend toward the fragmentary commitment of small assault groups, which rapidly develops into a series of small-scale actions at squad to, at most, company level. Units greeted by fire will turn away from action in piecemeal fashion as they encounter casualties or stiff opposition. This is well illustrated within the abstracted time/fire encounters of the multi-impulse movement fire phase. During the close combat phase, we see the crescendo of a full turn of intense building movement fire impulses. Here, house-to-house fighting gives way to room-to-room combat and takes its toll on attacker and defender alike. Artillery cannot help the attacker once he has mingled with the defender. Only by throwing in one unit after another can a block be cleared. This, if for no other reason, was why Frost could not have won. Without reinforcements, the British would eventually be bled white by a numerically superior enemy. In the final analysis, when one considers all of the compressed events of planning, execution, and results covered by each game turn, it becomes quite easy to accept the passage of 6 hours, or 12 during night turns, and a single game turn even in a tactical level game. Although most of the game is concerned with the 6-hour game turn, the longer night turn presents some interesting effects. The reduced movement cost for moving into an enemy-occupied area is fairly obvious. Under cover of darkness, streets can be crossed more safely, and small groups can infiltrate between defensive positions. To help deter this infiltration, the British set fire to small unoccupied structures in an effort to illuminate the area. For this reason, there is no less an effectiveness for attacks made totally within a common occupied area. The Germans took this technique one step further and soon set fire to the buildings occupied by the British. The actual number of attacks does not increase because of the greater mobility darkness affords units, coupled with the increased length of a night turn in real time. Artillery attacks as well as normal fire attacks from adjacent areas are reduced in effectiveness during night turns because of the difficulties in observation at any but the closest ranges. Finally, night turns allow the shifting of the tactical advantage to the German player on turns 3 and 6. The Germans showed considerable skill at infiltration tactics during the night hours, and the German commander at the bridge, Major Brinkmann, was a veteran of Stalingrad, and his experience was put to good use as the Germans repeatedly took advantage of darkness to position troops for the coming daylight attacks. When I first set out to design Storm over Arnhem, I wanted to produce, above all else, a game that allowed its participants to concentrate on the strategies of playing the game rather than memorizing endless rules and charts. To that end, I feel I have succeeded, and I would agree. Storm over Arnhem is a decent game that has held up somewhat well over time. Would be a great game to introduce to somebody who is new to wargaming. Also something that can be banged out in a relatively insignificant amount of time. It's not something you would need to have up for weeks and weeks in order to finish. Nice definition of a beer and pretzels game. I've played this a number of times. One of the first games that I had picked up, probably one of the first 5 or 6. And if you guys are like me, that was fueled by, of course, a movie mentioned earlier, A Bridge Too Far. Somebody seeing that, it can't help but be inspired and want to dive right into a simulation and or game representing such fighting. And this one, for a long time, was the most readily available. Since then, some other things have emerged that may have obviously surpassed this in simulation and quality. But again, this still holds up just fine for a Saturday night with you and a buddy and a couple of beers. So that is the designer's notes for Storm over Arnhem. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll talk to you guys next time.